Let me say this in peace, but with boldness. I've always found it strange when people say, "You're being over-spiritual," or "Don't over-spiritualize things." It makes me wonder, how can anyone walk too much in the Spirit of God? If we were talking about anything else other than God, people wouldn't say that. But the moment someone starts living boldly in God's truth, it suddenly becomes too much. Why? When I hear, "Don't over-spiritualize," it reminds me of the moment in the Garden of Eden when Satan deceived Eve. He made her believe that what God said was unnecessary, extreme, or controlling. Did God really say? Genesis 3 verse 1. That same spirit is alive today. The enemy still whispers, "You're doing too much. Calm down with all that God talk." But those whispers are a trap. They try to get us to turn down our obedience, compromise, and blend in instead of standing apart. It also reminds me of Jesus preaching truth, and the Pharisees wanting to stone him, John 8 verses 58 to 59. Why? Because his objective truth offended their religious pride and flesh. They weren't walking in spirit, they were walking in performance. And his presence exposed their hearts. So when people say, "You're being too spiritual," I hear something else. "You're making me uncomfortable because your full walk with God is exposing what I'm not ready to surrender." But let's be real, if we feel like we have to tone down our walk with God just to make others comfortable, then something is deeply off. That's not spiritual humility, that's spiritual shame, and it's rooted in fear, not faith. It's like we're trying to keep one foot in the world while pretending to walk with God. That's not being set apart, that's being double-minded, James 1 verse 8. We've been commanded in Galatians 5 verse 16 to walk by the Spirit and you will not gratify the desires of the flesh. Not sometimes. Not partially. Fully. God doesn't ask for part of us, He asks for all of us. And if we're being honest, sometimes we'd rather not walk fully in spirit because we don't want to offend people, or appear too intense. But the truth is, Jesus was radical. He said, "If your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off. If your right eye causes you to stumble, gouge it out," Matthew 5 verses 29 to 30. That's how seriously he took the call to holiness. So when people say, "Don't over-spiritualize," it's almost like a slap in God's face. Because God is spirit, John 4 verse 24, and He's called us to worship and live in spirit and in truth. You can't overdo spirit when you serve a God who is spirit. Satan wants us lukewarm, just warm enough to say we believe, but cold enough to stay disarmed. He wants us to straddle the line, one eye on God, one eye on the world, and then calls that balance. But you can't balance darkness with light. Let's stop pretending we can serve God on one hand and keep pieces of our flesh alive on the other. That's not a walk, that's a spiritual tug-of-war. And while we're tiptoeing, the enemy is planning. He's not confused about who he is or what he's after, so why are we? God's word says, "My people are destroyed for lack of knowledge." Because you have rejected knowledge, I also reject you as my priests. Because you have ignored the law of your God, I will also ignore your children. Hosea 4 verse 6, corrected for clarity. That's not just about ignorance, it's about rejection of truth. I refuse to be afraid of making people uncomfortable. What I'm really afraid of is standing before God one day and hearing Him say, "Depart from me, I never knew you." Matthew 7 verse 23. Not because I didn't believe, but because I compromised the walk. Because I hid the Spirit to please the flesh. Because I was afraid of being called too spiritual. Let me be clear, if I must cut off my ears not to hear what is unholy, then so be it. If I must gouge out my eyes to avoid seeing sin, so be it. If I must silence my tongue or lay down parts of myself, my hand, my reputation, my comfort, then so be it. I'm not afraid of that kind of loss. I'm afraid of losing God. Stephen, the first Christian martyr, was stoned for standing in spirit and truth, Acts 7. The disciples gave up everything. They weren't moderate. They weren't trying not to over-spiritualize. They were fully surrendered, even to death. Why? Because when you're aligned with God, the world will always say you're doing too much. But in heaven, obedience is never too much. So I'll say it plain. There is no such thing as too spiritual when you are walking in alignment with the Spirit of God. That phrase needs to die, because it's become a weapon Satan uses to shame people who are actually on the right path. You don't need to water down your faith to be relatable. You don't need to silence your convictions to be accepted. In God's eyes, there's no such thing as doing too much. There is only obedience or compromise. Full surrender or lukewarmness. And I know which one I'm choosing.